poems. I would like you to talk a little bit about your own poetry and writing poetry, but perhaps initially, if you wouldn't mind, could you
Sure.
read something? We had talked about it before, that's why it's conveniently
Right,
present.
conveniently placed.
Yeah.
My heavens, there's a poem of mine sitting right here. I should explain that anyone who is married knows that spouses periodically get on each other's nerves, and there's something wonderful about when they go away from each other for a while. I discovered, however, one few years ago that when my wife was away for a longer than usual period, it was somewhat disturbing coming home. I mean, it was like, it wasn't the same thing to come home. It was becoming bothersome that she wasn't there. In short, I missed her.
Yeah.
So I wrote this poem.
That's
So
a good
I
prelude.
tried to
Yeah.
figure, I began to put this together, and this is what I came up with. It's called Secret Music. The house, when she was gone, was like a false cadence, a song broken off. The song resumed when she returned. The house assumed its harmony. He was but the silence between tones, granting them sense. He understood, better than before, the fissure gaping, dividing take from give, something one must learn to live with, while the other thrives, defining sharply married lives. He still could hear the song she'd sounded to him for so long, and even found himself content, engaging love's original intent.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Thank you.
Being myself in a marriage and having experienced that, it resonates for me. So I'll keep that in my
So at least I hit it. I got,
You hit it,
I got
yeah.
wood on the ball, as they.
Yeah. Oh, a really lovely poem. When did you begin to write poetry? And could you tell us a little bit about your influences as a poet? I mean, the poets you like and the ones that you feel sort of shaped your sensibility?
I started writing poetry when I was in, I think I even did rhymes when I was a kid, but I definitely started writing it seriously when I was in my teens. Doesn't everyone?
Not everyone. I less so nowadays, I think.
But I think that there are certain things that happen in your life that we automatically think of writing a poem about. When we fall in love with the girl down the street, when we lose somebody that we care about, and certain call them religious or quasi-religious moments of transcendence.
Yeah.
We just don't feel that they can be expressed prosaically because they weren't prosaic, or we don't think they were prosaic.
Yeah.
Though everyone falls in love. So I actually started doing it because of I liked jingles. I liked the.
So you could have gone into advertising.
Yeah, and recently, one of the things I'm oddly proud of is a few weeks ago, on the eve of the royal wedding, someone in my office came up with an idea of Andrew Motion, the poet laureate, was not.
I read your poem.
Right.
Yes, on campus.
Well, I wrote that overnight, and I wrote it, and I thought a pretty good imitation of mock heroic verse.
We should. And it was an amusing, charming poem.
So obviously I've gone back to my roots, and I'm doing jingles again. You asked about influence. What's interesting about that is that the poets you like are not necessarily the ones that influence you. I really, really like T.S. Eliot. I would never undertake to try to write like him, because when I was in college, he was the cat's pajamas.
Right.
And whenever you write a poem in the style of T.S. Eliot, it always comes off reading like bad T.S. Eliot. It looks like, gee, I guess you were imitating T.S. Eliot, but not well.
It's like fiction writers trying to write like Henry James. It always sounds like bad Henry James.
Right.
Yeah.
Except for Max Beerbohm.
Oh, yeah.
Who wrote
what is the name of that?
It's In a Christmas Memory. I know it's In a Christmas Memory, and it was so funny. It is so funny that Henry James found it hilarious.
Really?
Yeah. It's hard to imagine Henry laughing out loud, but
well, chuckling softly.
Yes.
Yeah. But you do, speaking of jingles, you do have a proclivity to write in form, meaning with meter and even rhyme. And that, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that's written in what I have jocularly referred to as odd couplets.
Okay.
In that there's end rhymes, but the meter is mixed.
Okay. But there are some villanelles that I read of yours recently, and sonnets and so forth.
That villanelle was actually set to music, and I like that. I don't always do that. It seems to me that the form is suggested by whatever the heck it is you're trying to write about. That some subjects lend themselves to form. I mean, nothing could be worse than squeezing something into a form where it doesn't fit. And sometimes, and I like to also play around with a kind of chromatic rhyme, where the rhyme is actually there, but it's in the middle of the words and buried. It's a kind of play. And it's fun. And if you can say something at the same time.
As having fun, Do you see, how do you see your work as a book editor and your work and your writing poetry? Do they come together in some way, or are they two separate spheres? Do they inform each other?
They're pretty separate, because I've been doing the poetry all along. The poetry is something for me to, a little still place where you go to be sort of like the mandarin in his garden. So I'm fascinated by Chinese poetry. Of course, I can't read Chinese, so I got to depend on. But the idea that these people were all professional people who took some time out of the day to make sense of their lives poetically. I like that idea. So it's sort of the retreat from the more workaday aspect of your life. My job, I see it, and although you do bring up something that I think is worth, when I review poetry and when I have people review poetry, I like them to review it for what it says. I don't like them to get hung up in shop talk. I see. Meter, rhyme, so on and so forth, but to focus that this person is saying something. They may be saying it in a very formal way, or maybe not, but pay attention to what they're saying. The reason that is because I want the general reader to know that there's something, that the poetry isn't just five-finger exercises with words. This means something. It's important to you. What's the line that, is it William Carlos Williams, that men die for lack of what is in poems every day? There is no news in poems. I think people's lives are a little, if they don't have poetry in their lives are a little, impoverished is exactly the word. So do you tell your review, I mean, have there been times when you have had a review and you've sent it back and said, make it more accessible, or make it more so that readers can see what this is about? I like to think I choose my reviewers with care. And so you don't have to send it back. And I tell them to, well, usually the people who review poetry are usually people who read it and understand that what I will tell people if they haven't done a poetry review that's what I want. That's what you want, I don't want endless discussions. Every now and then you've got to do it. I mean, you've got to, it would be kind of silly to just talk about a villanelle without telling somebody that it was. But that's what I like. On a week-to-week basis, what I like to do is I like to hope that when somebody opens the paper on Sunday, they will see a set of reviews there that are interesting to read about books that may or may not be interesting to read, although mostly interesting to read because the reality of the book reviewing business, in case anybody didn't notice, is that it's shrinking. And that there is less space. I see that everywhere. Reviews have to be shorter, which is actually not a bad idea. And they are going to be fewer. So I've deliberately made a choice to try to find books that are worth reading, as opposed to, first of all, it's harder to write about a book that you like. If you don't like a book, there's nothing easier to write than a pan. Because you just take out your gun and start firing. But to say why you like something, why it moved you, is hard. And to say it in 750 words or less is even harder. That's interesting. So you would say that given the shrinking space, your tendency is to try, I mean, obviously you can't know in advance, but try and choose books that are worth reading and therefore where the reviews will be fairly positive. I mean,
Yeah.
my column is a recommendation column.
You have a Sunday editor's choice column.
Right.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you how you choose those. I mean,
Well, I can tell you how I
Yeah.
chose to make it a recommendation column, because I was slogging my way through a book which I will not name. Well, I will name it. It was Tatiana Tolstoy's The Slinks. And it was a gloomy, depressing book.
Yeah.
And it was a Saturday, my day off, and I'm thinking to myself, I could spend my entire weekend in this miserable world here. And then a light bulb went on over my head, and I said, no, I don't. I'm the book editor. I can review anything I want.
you're not going to review
And I
it.
can review
Yeah.
a book that I feel like reading. So I did, and decided right there. And I thought that was more service to the reader.
So before that, you had thought this was perhaps a book you should review.
Yeah.
And now you've moved to a different point.
Yeah, it was going to come down that I was going to be spending 24 inches in the paper, 24 column inches, telling everybody what a bad book this is. Who needs to know? Or what a bad book I thought it was, because I think it's really important for people to realize that because I do not like a book doesn't mean that the book is bad.
Right.
Unless, of course, we're talking about the Da Vinci Code, which is bad.
Right, I'd agree with you there. Now, you did review, I believe you reviewed Saturday,
Yeah.
Ian McEwan, and you liked it. I mean, I have not read that book yet. I read Atonement and thought it was a wonderful book.
Well, that's an interesting
Yeah.
thing. Someone came to me after I wrote that review and said, well, I guess I won't bother to read that book, because it's a problematic book.
Yeah.
I recommended that book because it's a fascinating book to read.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I like it. It's sort of like I admire it.
Yes.
There is nothing you can criticize it for, because any criticism you want to raise about it, Ian McEwan would say, but that's exactly what
my
fits
point
into
is,
the.
yeah.
The
Yeah.
problem is that his clinical detachment from his characters.
It's a bloodless thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was a novel I reviewed, The Bishop's Wife, I think it's called, although that, like the movie, by A.N. Wilson. And it was a strange experience. Wilson was so cruel to his protagonist. I mean, it was like willfully cruel. It was a very unsettling thing to read. Interestingly, his new book is being reviewed by someone who just called me up on the phone and said the same thing. Now, you're a novelist. Isn't that a strange? You must have a certain affection for your characters.
I do, but you know, I think novelists have different relationships to their characters. I like to read books where the author has affection, but that is perhaps a sentimental strain in myself that is not necessarily. I don't know that I'm altogether proud of that.
Thomas Hardy is probably cruel to his.
Yeah.
But not all, and I think that may be a flaw in a novelist.
I think there should be affection somewhere.
Right.
I mean, even Jonathan Franzen, for example, those are, you know, his characters in the corrections they're problematic to say the least, but there is something there. I don't know if I'd call it affection, but I think that lifts it above that level of cruelty.
Have you read A.S. Byatt's tetralogy? One of the volumes in that, there is one of the strangest episodes in fiction that I'm aware of. There's the wife of this Anglican priest is making dinner,
Yeah.
and something is wrong with the refrigerator, and she gets underneath the refrigerator to check the wire, and she's electrocuted. It's a complete accident.
Yeah.
You don't usually see that in.
Yeah.
And I talked to her about it. She had the experience of what he says later on. What is this? You go out of the house, you say goodbye to somebody in the morning, come home, and
Yeah.
they're there, and they'll never be
Yeah.
there again. That happened to A.S. Byatt. She told me that she could write about that because she knew what that
Because
was
she
like.
knew it. Yeah. Well, I would like to continue on, but
We're running out of
We're
time.
running out of time. It has been a pleasure. Thank you very much for talking with us.
Thank you for
Frank
having me.
Wilson. And thank you for joining us today for the Drexel interview.